our next project, Small to Tall. This is going to be the first project where we delve into abstraction. I define abstraction as the distortion or stylization of form for expressive purposes. Now, usually when people think of abstraction, they think of things that don't necessarily represent what we're used to seeing when we observe reality. But things that are abstract can either be representational, that is, they can look like what we see in nature, or they can be non-representational. Another couple terms that describe that same dualism is objective versus non-objective. Objective being what we can see with the eye in nature, in the world of man, in the universe, and or non-objective, which would be more things of the mind that we don't really see occurring in nature. I make these distinctions because both can be abstract. Abstraction is simply taking what you see in nature and changing it. So you can change the shape of a human being, but it can still look like a human being, i.e. a stick figure. A stick figure would be an abstraction of a human figure. You can change the color of the object. You could make a purple human being, even though purple human beings don't generally exist in nature. You can change the scale or the size. You can change the dimensionality. You can change the texture. You can change how that human being or that object fits into space. Whenever you change or stylize or distort the various formal elements and principles of art and design in your representation or non-representation of an object or objects, you are abstracting. In this particular project, we're going to be using some more principles: cropping, repetition, rhythm, and the notion of what we call afocal compositional balance. This would be an example of abstraction through simplification and stylization. And the title of this particular project is Small to Tall. When I refer to afocal compositional approaches, it's two artists kind of exemplify this idea: Edward Weston and Via Selmans. Edward Weston is a 20th century photographer, and Via Selmans is a 20th, 21st century painter, printmaker, and draftsman. Both of them create afocal compositions by cropping or zooming in on a subject matter. Now, in order to explain what afocal compositions are, I'm going to show you what an afocal composition isn't in the work of Edward Weston. But I am going to show you how the way that he depicts things, even though they're photographic, the way that he composes, the way that he uses light, the way that he uses space, the way that he contextualizes his objects, all lend a very abstract, expressive kind of dynamic in the work that he is exploring in his photography. So when we think of photography, we think of it being very objective, very naturalistic, very quote-unquote realistic. But in reality, the artist can use tools of photography to push or stylize the edge of representation into what we would call abstract territory. So first we'll show you a couple of examples of how he does this without the afocal compositional balance, and then we'll show you exactly what I mean when I say afocal. So here's a good example of a work by Edward Weston. Now when we first see this work, we're kind of unsure of what it is. Whenever we're unsure of what something is, it's abstract. It's not concrete. We begin to be very subjective in our interpretation of the work. So everyone who sees this work is going to see something different. Some people see a heart or some sort of internal organ. Some people see some sort of ceramic vessel, maybe, or a non-representational sculpture of some sort. Some people even see human figures embracing. In reality, this is a green pepper, a deformed green pepper, but a green pepper nonetheless. Edward Weston was really interested in organic material. He had a garden, and he would bring the fruit of his garden back into his studio and would set it up and play around with lighting and exposure and composition in an effort to make us see the ordinary as extraordinary. So one of the ways that he's able to make us see this as other than is by obviously abstracting the color. So anytime you take color and remove it and make it just black and white, that's a distortion of reality. It's become abstract. The other way that he's helped us to see this vegetable as different than we might ordinarily see it is by this high contrast of light and dark. He really upped the contrast in the photo. Really rich darks, really spectacular highlights. And that all makes this object seem a little bit other than what we would ordinarily see if we saw it, for instance, on the kitchen counter or at the grocery store. That would be another aspect of his abstraction. He's taken it out of the context of where we would ordinarily see it. It's not in a grocery store. It's not on a table. It's just against a kind of nondescript background. And that decontextualizing makes our attention focus less on any kind of story and more on pure form. So we're not seeing this as part of a cooking experience or a shopping experience or eating experience. It looks like a sculpture, like some monumental sculpture. It's even kind of a low angle kind of composition, obviously iconic, centralized, but we're seeing it either at eye level or slightly below where we would ordinarily be seeing it from above, and that gives the sculpture much more of a physical presence of being rather than just being a thing. It's got personality. Here's another piece by Weston that's not an afocal composition, but another iconic composition. Again, you notice the characteristic dark light, background setup, figure ground setup. Here, texture is very important. All of these wonderful organic textures, strong light and shadow as before. This is a piece of wilting lettuce. You know, it's dehydrated, it's drooping, starting to become more hollow as opposed to flat as we would see in a healthy piece of lettuce. And of course, that gives it this very dramatic, enjoyable surface texture that our eye loves to be dazzled by. But again, it doesn't make us think of lettuce, partly because it's black and white. It could be an alien, it could be a landscape, it could be a piece of clothing. When you abstract, when you take things out of context, as he's doing here, when you turn up the theatricality of the lighting, as he's doing here, when you concentrate on minute and subtle detail, as he's doing here, and exaggerated detail, as he's doing here, you start to create mystery that is more about the experience of looking than it is solving the mystery. Now these next pieces are afocal, and I think you can see right away that the subjects are cropped in such a way as to remove all negative space. Still high contrast, light and dark. Still concerned with texture. Still concerned with organic form and shape, but definitively taking it out of context by zooming in and removing any hint of a negative space. Then we really start to focus on pattern and specifically the repetition of line, in this case, and the variations of that repeated line, or the rhythms within that repeated line. So, this shape is the same as this shape, but it's not. It varies. This is more oblong, this is more spherical. This is more at an angle, this is more at a horizontal. The lines become thinner and thicker, but they're all very similar in their quality. So these minor variations in line thickness and shape type and lightness and darkness of coming forward as far as projecting towards the viewer or going back as far as going away from the viewer. All of these are very subtle aberrations within a spectrum of type that's similar but not the same. So it's all about the unity and the variety within this very harmonically similar subject matter. And that's really what we're looking for in our projects, is a surface like this onion or this piece of cut lettuce that isn't about more than one object or one object in negative space. It's about the singular object. And more than anything, one of the strategies you can use is really zooming in close to the object. And we're going to be drawing these at 18 by 24, so you're taking something very small and making it very large or tall, thus the name of the project. So, look at the concave versus the convex, the flat versus the curvilinear, the deep versus the shallow, the light versus the dark, the smooth versus the rough. Think very much about variations in type, differences, minor differences, or major differences, but differences within a limited range. That's where you start exploring that repetition and rhythm within the same context. Here's another image. It's a large space. In this case, it's a desert. But again, it expresses what we're talking about when it comes to afocal compositions. So you really want to look at a single surface or shape type, texture. Via Selmans is another artist that explores the same approach, but instead of using photography, she uses painting and drawing and printmaking. So she's going to be another artist who focuses on the afocal, that focuses on rhythmic repetition in an effort to explore unity and variation. So it's about looking for a pattern of repeated shapes, but looking for within that pattern shapes that are dynamic enough in their shape, their scale, their value, their color, their texture, to be interesting to look at. So here's her probably most explored surface, which is the water. She has made hundreds and thousands of paintings and drawings and prints of water, or the surface of water, which, of course, if you've ever looked at the surface of water, it is very mesmerizing and dynamic, and she tries to capture that in one image that's still. Notice that, while there is no figure-ground relationship, there is a spatial quality to the work, so near, far, and of course that's demonstrated by larger, darker, more texture, more contrast of value, to moderate to smaller, less contrast, shorter shapes, lighter tones, not a lot of dark tones. All of this creates a difference between foreground and background. It's all a repetition of a form, which is the wave, but it's different over time and space. So nearer versus farther. And I think space is something you do want to look for in your images. It doesn't have to be deep space like the surface of a pond or the desert or a field. In fact, I'd prefer it if you concentrated on smaller spaces. But you still want to find some indication of space, of nearness, farness, closer to you, more distant. She also does images of space, like outer space, and images that explore spider webs or fields of rock or fields of grass, just any kind of field in nature. And I'm talking about a visual field, not an actual field per se. So the first step of the project, as far as our creative process, is to find a composition. So I want you to collect at least 5 photographs, not of the same subject matter. You can take the photographs or find them online, but a variety of different subject matters. In fact, I would recommend that you do take some of your own. Go exploring, find some subject matter on your own to explore as opposed to finding it online. If you must go online to do that, that's fine, but you don't have to. And just collect many and much so that when we come back at the next class, I can say yay or nay as far as it fulfilling the afocal qualification and the other formal and principial qualifications that we need to set as far as boundaries of comprehension. I would recommend organic forms, but that's not limit. I think you could look at, say, a sweater, or you could look at a basket, or you could look at other man-made things like that. But those types of man-made things are more organic than, say, a computer circuit board, which has some of the qualities, but it's very geometric and regularized. And we want to see more subtlety in the variations. So here's some examples of finished student drawings that we'll run through. Or I'm sorry, finished student reference photographs that we'll run through. So a field of rocks, and there's the repetition of the rocks and the texture of the rocks as individual things, and then there's the textures of the surfaces of the rocks. There's lots of variation in scale and color and value, surface texture, things that are near, things that are far, things that are very visible, things that are less visible. Here's the same thing but underwater. So you've got the surface under and the surface over, but still it's a surface that we're seeing through. So the transparency of the surface of the water, it's actually 3 surfaces. You've got what's under, you've got the surface of the water itself, and then you have the reflection of the sky. But it's not a figure-ground relationship. It's an all-over afocal composition. Wood has a lot of interesting textures, some more subtle, and then some more dynamic. So smooth versus rough, closer to us, farther away, flat surface, concave surface, rough surface, more linear in a vertical sense, more horizontal. This is a much more dramatic surface of wood, obviously bark, various lichen, nearer, farther, bigger, smaller, in the middle, more texture, less texture, or a different kind of texture. If you squint at it, darker, middle, lighter. Cedar bark. You can see these convex, cylindrical forms here in the tree versus the flatter surface that you see in this close-up. This is a rock surface, which to me reminds me of the bark texture. Lots of different actual textures, and then in this case there's even these visual textures, which are stains of oxidation or rust in the rocks. Here's man-made rock, pavement that's cracked, pavement that's painted and starting to split apart. And again, you've got, far, middle, near, surface texture that's more painted or two-dimensional versus actual textures, dark and light. Here's a pile of sticks and pine cones. Now you may argue that, this is ground, this is figure, and you would be right to a degree, but it's all over. It's not a clear single object, say in the middle or the top left with a lot of different object on the surround. It's all over texture and lots of different varieties. Same thing here. Predominantly all leaf though. And really, this would be back here as well. It's just farther away and more obscure because it's seen from far away. Same thing here. So really, it's more about that object being seen again in the negative space and in the positive space. So really there is no true negative space in that it's not a separate object. And that's really what we're looking for. And here's some student drawings. Hair, rope, basket. This is a piece of driftwood. This is some sort of woven fabric. Beautiful. And here's the side-by-side of the reference of a leaf that a student found and the actual drawing itself. So you can kind of, I think, get the idea of where we're going. So by the next class, you want to have between 5 and 10 photographs of afocal compositions, natural objects that demonstrate rhythm and repetition of space and shape and value, texture, light and shadow as far as the sense of direction of light and mass. And mostly we're looking for natural materials. So we will see you for the next class.